The Dakota sun beat down on Redemption Creek, baking the dust into a fine ochre powder that coated every surface and clung to the back of the throat. For Ara Mayfield, the town was a necessary ordeal, a place of noise and ghosts she endured only for sacks of flour and tins of coffee. She preferred the vast, eloquent silence of her homestead, where the wind spoke a language of solitude she had come to understand. Today, however, the town was about to scream. She was tying a sack of oats to the saddle of her mare Bess, her back to the main street, when the first gunshot cracked the oppressive midday heat. It was a sharp, angry sound that sliced through the lazy drone of flies and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. A woman shrieked. Ara's head snapped up, her body instantly rigid. Another shot followed, and then a chaotic volley. The world erupted. Glass shattered from the front window of the Redemption Bank. Men poured out, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, sacks slung over their shoulders. They moved with a brutal, practiced efficiency. One of them, taller than the rest, was clearly Lakota, his movements fluid and cat-like, even in the heavy boots of a white man. He moved with the coiled grace of a hunter, a stark contrast to the lumbering panic of the townsfolk scrambling for cover. Ara reacted without thinking, pulling Bess into the narrow alley between the general store and the assayer's office. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the symphony of chaos. From the sliver of shadow, she had a clear, terrifying view of the street. Men and women dove behind water troughs and overturned wagons. The air, thick with dust, now tasted of acrid gunpowder. Then, through the swirling confusion, a figure of order emerged. Sheriff Silas Blackwood stepped out of his office, a pistol in each hand, his face a mask of grim determination. He was the town's anchor, a man whose reputation for fairness was as polished as the tin star on his chest. "Drop your weapons." He boomed, his voice a commanding roar that cut through the panic. "This is your only warning." The robbers returned fire slugs, thudding into the wooden facade of the sheriff's office. Blackwood, impossibly calm, dropped to one knee, taking careful aim. He didn't fire at the men closest to him. His gaze was fixed on the Lakota man who was providing cover for the others as they mounted their horses. The sheriff's pistol bucked in his hand. The Lakota warrior cried out, stumbling, clutching his side. He staggered, but did not fall. With a final defiant look towards the sheriff, he launched himself onto the back of a waiting pinto, and the entire gang galloped away in a thunder of hooves and a cloud of choking dust. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief. People emerged from their hiding places, their faces pale with shock, but alive with admiration for their protector. "He got one of them, Sheriff," a man shouted. "You saved the bank." Blackwood rose to his feet, holstering his pistols with a weary sigh. He projected an aura of reluctant heroism, a man simply doing his duty. He began to calm the crowd, his voice smooth and reassuring, a balm on their frayed nerves. But Ara, still hidden in the alley, saw what no one else did. In the moment before the townspeople had swarmed him, Blackwood's eyes had swept the street, and for a fraction of a second, his gaze locked with two of his own deputies, Jedediah Stone and Caleb Finch, who were just emerging from the saloon looking for all the world like they had missed the entire affair. Blackwood gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. A signal. And in the deputy's eyes, Ara saw not relief, but the cool, calculating acknowledgement of a job well done. Her blood ran cold. The deputies. They had been among the masked robbers. She was certain of it. The lumbering gait of the one who had nearly tripped over the hitching post was Jedediah's. The twitchy, bird-like movements of another matched Caleb Finch perfectly. The robbery hadn't been a robbery. It had been a performance. A piece of theater staged by the law itself, with the Lakota man cast as the villain. A wave of nausea washed over her. The whole town was celebrating a lie, and she was the only one who had seen behind the curtain. Her gaze darted back to the spot where the Lakota man had been shot. Something small and dark lay in the dust, overlooked in the chaos. It was a single feather, intricately carved, its delicate form, telling a story of patient hands. She had to have it. It was a piece of the truth, a tangible anchor in the sea of deception that had just swallowed Redemption Creek. Waiting until the crowd had fully converged around the heroic sheriff, Ara slipped from the alley. Her movements were swift and silent. She bent down, pretending to adjust her bootlace, and her fingers closed around the object. It was warm from the sun, crafted from bone or antler into the shape of a hawk's feather. As she straightened up the carved feather hidden in her palm, her eyes met Blackwood's across the crowded street. His friendly, heroic smile was gone. For a fleeting instant, his blue eyes narrowed, becoming chips of glacial ice. He had seen her. He didn't know what she had picked up or what she had witnessed, but he knew she had been in that alley. He knew she was a loose thread in his perfectly woven tapestry of lies. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Ara. She untied Bess's reins with trembling fingers mounted and rode out of town, not even daring to look back. She didn't spur the horse into a gallop. That would draw attention. She maintained a steady, measured pace, every inch of her skin prickling with the feeling of being watched. The plains that had always represented solace now felt like a barren, exposed stage. The whispering prairie grass seemed to hiss a warning. He knows. He saw you. The carved feather in her pocket felt both as light as a whisper and as heavy as a tombstone. She had fled the ghosts of her past to find peace in this unforgiving land. But she had just ridden headlong into a nightmare, far more terrifying than any memory. 2 days passed in a haze of taut silence. The homestead, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind in the cottonwoods sent a jolt of fear through her. She kept her late husband Thomas's Winchester rifle loaded and closed a cold, heavy reassurance against the terror that had taken root in her heart. She replayed the scene in town over and over, the sheriff's subtle nod, the cold flash in his eyes. It was a truth so monstrous, it felt unreal. Yet the solid weight of the carved feather in her apron pocket confirmed it with every movement. On the 3rd morning, the wind, a restless spirit sweeping down from the Black Hills, carried a scent that cut through the familiar aromas of pine and soil. It was the metallic tang of blood, a grim specter from her former life as a doctor's wife. Her gaze swept the horizon, a familiar ritual now imbued with a new, desperate urgency. And then she saw it. A pinto horse stood unnaturally still near the cottonwood grove that bordered her small creek. Its coat was a stark map of white and brown against the green of the trees, and on its flank, something dark glistened wetly in the sun. It was the horse from the robbery. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. Setting down the basket of herbs she'd been collecting, Ara moved with a caution that had become second nature. The West didn't reward the reckless. As she drew closer, the details sharpened into a horrifying tableau. The horse was lathered in sweat, its eyes wide with fear, its reins tangled in a low-hanging branch. But it was the saddle that stole her breath. It was a simple, functional thing, clearly of Lakota make, but it was ruined. A slick, dark arterial spray painted the seat and fender so thick in places it had begun to coagulate into grim jewels. Below the saddle, a long, ugly smear of blood stained the pinto's white hide, a testament to a rider who had clung on with failing strength. This wasn't just the work of the bullet she had seen strike home. This was a story of a desperate, agonizing ride, of a life leaking into the leather with every beat of a dying heart. Her eyes darted from the horse to the ground. The trail was easy to follow: scuffed earth, a broken branch, and then a series of drag marks leading into the thicker brush of the creek bed. She hesitated for only a second. Thomas had taught her many things, but the most important was that a life, any life, was worth fighting for. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she pushed aside a curtain of willow branches and stepped into the shaded cool of the grove. He lay half submerged in the shallow, babbling water, his body wedged against a smooth, moss-covered boulder. It was the man from the bank. The single eagle feather tied into his long, black hair was dark and heavy with creek water. One arm was flung out his hand, clutching a fistful of mud and roots, as if he had tried to pull himself further onto the bank. The water around his hips was a diluted, swirling pink. Ara moved silently to his side, her mind shifting from apprehensive homesteader to the doctor's assistant she had once been. Her fingers went to his neck, searching for the thrum of life beneath the cold, damp skin. It was there, faint, thready, and dangerously slow. But it was there. Gently, she turned his head. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of pain, even in unconsciousness. With practiced hands, she began to assess the damage. His tunic was soaked through, not just with water, but with the hot, sticky dampness of his own lifeblood. She found the entry wound on his left side, low in the abdomen. A gut shot. She had seen wounds like this before in Thomas's makeshift surgery. The bullet would have torn through his insides, starting a fire of infection that no medicine in this God-forsaken land could quench. He had minutes, an hour perhaps, if he was impossibly strong. But he was dying. The realization hit her not with panic, but with a cold, clear certainty. A profound sadness washed over her. This warrior, this stranger, would die here alone, his name unknown, his story untold. A sudden, fierce resolve burned through her sorrow. She couldn't save him, but she could offer him a measure of dignity. She would not let him die alone in the water. Wasting no more time. She hooked her arms under his, her muscles straining against his dead weight. Gritting her teeth, she pulled, dragging him from the creek's embrace, inch by painful inch. The water streamed from his clothes, running pink over the stones of the bank. She pulled him onto the soft grass, his head lolling to one side. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound of such profound agony it made her own stomach clench. His eyes fluttered open. They were dark, fathomless, and for a fleeting moment filled with a wild, cornered animal fear. Then they focused on her face. The fear receded, replaced by a dazed confusion. He tried to speak, but only a wet, rasping sound came out. "Easy," she murmured, her voice soft. "You're safe for now. Just rest." She knew it was a lie, but it was the only comfort she had to offer. Getting him back to the cabin was a monumental task. Ara was strong, her body hardened by relentless labor, but the warrior was a solid weight. She fetched Bess, and with a series of ropes and blankets, managed to create a makeshift travois. The journey was slow and agonizingly careful. Every jostle elicited a low moan from her passenger. She laid him on the simple cot in the corner of her one-room cabin, the one Thomas had built and had later died in. The irony was a bitter pill. She worked quickly, her hands moving with an efficiency born of grim experience. She cut away the blood-soaked buckskin tunic, revealing the taut, muscled torso beneath. The wound was angry and dark. There was nothing to be done for the internal damage, but she could at least clean him. He drifted in and out of consciousness. In his lucid moments, his dark eyes would follow her movements, not with fear anymore, but with a kind of weary resignation. He knew just as she did. The unspoken truth hung in the air between them. "Water," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. She lifted his head carefully, holding a tin cup to his lips. He managed only a few small sips before his strength failed him. His eyes closed for a long moment, but then they opened again, and this time there was a flicker of urgency in their depths. "Listen." He breathed the word, costing him a visible effort. Ara leaned closer, her ear just inches from his mouth. "I'm here," she said softly. "I'm listening." A spasm of pain racked his body. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. When the wave passed, he spoke again, his words fragmented, pushed out on the last of his air. "Black rock, where the creek turns to poison. They take the yellow stone from Mother Earth's bones." Ara frowned. Black rock. She knew of a landmark by that name, a grim volcanic outcropping several miles north, deep in the hills the Lakota considered sacred. Yellow stone. Gold. He was talking about a gold mine, an illegal one on Lakota land. He coughed a wet, rattling sound that sent a fresh slick of crimson to the corner of his lips. She wiped it away gently. "The man with the tin star," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers, pleading with her to understand. "He is no lawman. He is a thief. He leads them." Her dread solidified. He was confirming the monstrous truth she had witnessed. The warrior's hand, surprisingly strong, suddenly grabbed her wrist. His touch was cold, his skin clammy, but his grip was iron. "He cannot have this." He gasped, his other hand fumbling inside the waistband of his leggings. His fingers emerged, clutching an object. He pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers around it. It was another carved feather, a near-perfect twin to the one she had found in the dust. "For Wombly." "My brother," he breathed. "Show him. He will know." "Wombly," she repeated, committing the name to memory. "Where will I find him?" The warrior's eyes were clouding over the light within them, fading. His grip on her wrist loosened. "He will find the trail," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He always finds the trail." His body went limp, his head turning to the side. A final shuddering breath escaped his lips, and then silence. The only sound in the cabin was the gentle crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of Ara's own heart. She stood there for a long time, and the two carved feathers clutched in her hand, and the weight of the man's last words settling upon her. He had not just given her a message. He had given her a burden, a truth that could get her killed. She had brought him here to offer him a dignified death, but instead he had thrust her into the heart of his life's final conflict. With a heavy sigh, she gently closed his eyes. That night, under the cold, unblinking light of 1,000 stars, Ara dug a grave on the small rise behind her cabin, next to the single wooden cross that marked Thomas's final resting place. She worked until her hands were raw and her back screamed in protest. She wrapped the warrior's body in one of her cleanest blankets and gently lowered him into the earth. As she filled the grave shovel full by shovelful, she made a promise to the silent earth. She would not let his death be for nothing. His name was Kangi, a name she had learned from his brother. She would find Wombly, and she would make sure the man with the tin star answered for the blood on the saddle. Ara knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. The unmarked grave on the hill was a constant, silent accusation. She needed information, a better understanding of the monster she was facing. She had to return to Redemption Creek, not as a frightened witness, but as a careful observer. She had to listen to the whispers in the dust. Her first stop was the cluttered, sour-smelling office of Doc Abernathy. He was a man drowning his failures in cheap whiskey, but he had once been a friend of Thomas's, and his memory, when not clouded by drink, was long. "Ara," he slurred, blinking up at her from behind a half-empty bottle. "What brings you to this temple of misery?" "Hello, Martin." she said gently, ignoring the stench of stale liquor. "I needed to ask you something about Sheriff Blackwood." Abernathy snorted, pouring himself another drink with a shaky hand. Blackwood, the town saint. What about him? He was very helpful after the commotion the other day. She began choosing her words with care. "I noticed his pistol has an unusual design on the grip. A silver serpent." The doctor took a long swallow, his eyes distant. "Unusual eye. He and a couple of his business partners had him made. A little club of theirs back in the mining camps. Called themselves the Serpent Syndicate or some such nonsense before Blackwood decided to pin on a star and call himself respectable. Him, Jedediah Stone, Caleb Finch, a few others. They take the yellow stone from Mother Earth's bones." The pieces were clicking into place. "So the sheriff was a prospector before he was a lawman?" Ara asked, keeping her tone casual. "That's how he made his fortune," Abernathy grumbled. "Found a rich seam somewhere up in the hills. He's a wealthy man, Ara. Don't let the simple tin star fool you. Wealthy men don't get that way by being saints." He looked at her, then a flicker of his old intelligence shining through the alcoholic fog. "You be careful around him. He's not the man he pretends to be. He's got a darkness in him. I saw it once. Had to patch up a man Blackwood brought in. Said the fellow resisted arrest. The man's injuries told a different story. Blackwood's a man who enjoys his work too much, if you take my meaning." Ara left the doctor's office with a knot of fear tightening in her gut. She crossed the street to Gable's General Store, the town's nerve center for gossip. Martha Gable, a woman with a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing, was holding court at the counter. Ara browsed the shelves, feigning interest in bolts of cloth, slowly making her way closer. "And the sheriff is heading out again tomorrow," Martha was saying, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Another one of his patrols up into the Black Hills. Takes him 3-4 days sometimes. Takes Jed and Caleb with him, too. Leaves the town with no law at all, if you ask me. Says he's tracking rustlers," the other woman added. "But I ask you what rustlers are way up there. He always comes back with his saddlebags heavy, though." "Heavy with justice," I'm sure Martha said with a sniff that conveyed utter disbelief. Ara's hands froze on a tin of coffee. A patrol to the Black Hills, near the landmark called Black Rock. It had to be. He wasn't patrolling. He was mining, using his position as sheriff as the perfect cover. He and his killer deputies would be gone for days. This was her chance, a window of opportunity to find Wombly without Blackwood breathing down her neck. As she was leaving, her eyes fell upon the public notice board. Pinned among advertisements for tonics and land sales was a crude, hand-drawn sketch of a horse. A pinto with distinctive markings, Kangi's horse. The notice, signed by Sheriff Blackwood, offered a reward for information on a horse stolen by Lakota renegades. He was controlling the story, turning his victim into a thief. She had to move fast. She remembered Thomas speaking of a large Lakota summer encampment, often set up in a hidden valley known as Whisper Wind Canyon. It was a long shot, a dangerous ride into territory where she would be seen as an intruder. But it was the only lead she had. As she rode out of Redemption Creek, she felt a profound shift within herself. She was no longer just a widow hiding from grief. She was a keeper of secrets, a hunter of truths. The risk was enormous, but the thought of letting Silas Blackwood continue to hide his crimes behind a tin star and a handsome smile was unbearable. She would ride to Whisperwind Canyon. She would find Wombly. Ara never made it to Whisperwind Canyon. She was 2 days into her preparations, packing dried meat and checking the worn soles of her boots, when the sound of approaching horses sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her. It wasn't the plodding gait of a lone rider. It was two horses moving at a confident, deliberate pace. Peeking through a crack in her cabin door, she saw them Sheriff Blackwood and his twitchy deputy Caleb Finch. They hadn't gone on their patrol after all. Or perhaps this visit was the first stop. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She forced herself to take a slow, deep breath, moving the Winchester from its place by the door, to lean against the table within easy reach, but not an open challenge. She smoothed her apron, erased the fear from her face, and stepped outside, blinking in the bright sun. "Sheriff," she said, her voice betraying only a hint of surprise. "I wasn't expecting visitors." Mrs. Mayfield Blackwood said, swinging down from his horse with practiced grace. His smile was as bright and false as a lead dollar. "Caleb and I were just riding the perimeter. Thought we'd stop in, see how you were faring after your little scare the other day." Caleb Finch remained mounted, his shifty eyes darting around the homestead, lingering on the barn and the corral, the small rise where two graves lay hidden from this angle. He was the lookout. "That's very thoughtful of you," Ara said, her gaze fixed on Blackwood. "As you can see, everything is quiet." "Quiet is good," the sheriff said, his eyes roaming her face, searching for cracks in her composure. "I just wanted to follow up. That pinto you reported seeing matches the description of a horse stolen from a prospector. We have reason to believe the Lakota who stole it might be part of a radical band that's been causing trouble. He was weaving his web of lies, testing her, waiting to see if she would challenge it." "I see," she said, simply giving him nothing. Blackwood took a step closer. The scent of leather and bay rum wafted from him, a civilized scent at odds with the predatory gleam in his eyes. "The thing is, Mrs. Mayfield, a woman alone out here. It's a vulnerable position. All sorts of things can happen. Accidents, fires, unfortunate encounters." The veiled threat hung in the air between them, shimmering and ugly. This was an interrogation and a warning. "I manage," she said, her voice cold. His smile tightened. "I'm sure you do. You seem like a very resourceful woman. But resources can only take you so far. Alliances, friendships, those are what truly keep people safe out here. I like to think of myself as a friend to the good people of this territory. It was a devil's bargain. Stay silent and be protected. Oppose him and face the consequences." His patience finally snapped. The charming facade cracked, revealing the cold, hard ruthlessness beneath. "Let's stop playing games, Mrs. Mayfield. Jedediah paid you a visit. He told me about the grave, the new one up on the hill next to your husband." Ara's blood turned to ice. A dog died," she stammered the lie, weak and pathetic even to her own ears. Blackwood laughed, a short, ugly sound. "A dog? You buried a dog with the same care you gave your husband? I don't think so. You found him, didn't you, the Indian? Now the only question is, what did he say to you before he died?" He took another step, closing the distance between them, until he was looming over her. Caleb shifted on his horse, his hand now resting fully on his gun. Ara stood her ground. "He said nothing," she said, her voice clear and steady. "He was already dead when I found him in the creek." "Is that so?" Blackwood purred. He reached out, and before she could react, his fingers brushed against the leather pouch at her belt where she kept the feathers. "Then what are you carrying that's so precious? A keepsake from a dead man?" Panic surged through her. She backed away, her hand instinctively going to the pouch. "That's none of your business." "I'm the law in this territory, Mrs. Mayfield." He hissed, his blue eyes flashing with fury. "Everything is my business." He lunged for the pouch, but Ara was faster. She sidestepped, her hand darting out and grabbing the handle of a nearby water bucket. With all her strength, she swung it, sloshing a gallon of cold well water directly into the sheriff's face and chest. He sputtered, shocked and enraged, stumbling back. That was all the opening she needed. She darted back into the cabin, slamming the heavy wooden door and dropping the thick bar into place just as Blackwood's body crashed against it. "Don't just sit there, you idiot. Get this door open." Blackwood roared, his voice muffled by the wood. Ara scrambled for the Winchester, her hands shaking, but her mind strangely calm. The confrontation she had feared was here. She levered around into the chamber, the metallic snick-clack, a sound of finality. She moved to the small window, peering out. Caleb was dismounting, fumbling with a rope. She rested the rifle barrel on the windowsill, took aim not at him, but at the ground by his feet, and fired. The shot exploded through the quiet afternoon. Dirt sprayed into the deputy's face. He yelped like a kicked dog, dropping the rope and scrambling backward. "The next one won't miss," Ara shouted, her voice raw with a courage she didn't know she possessed. "Get around the back," Caleb Blackwood's furious voice cut through the air. Ara knew she was trapped. Her defiance had bought her moments, nothing more. But as Caleb scurried for cover, his panicked movements drew her eyes toward the distant hills. And she saw it. A flicker of movement, a flash of light, like the sun glinting off a piece of metal or glass. It was there for a second, then gone. It was miles away. But it was something. Someone was out there. Someone was watching. A desperate hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing, flickered in her heart. "This can end one of two ways," Mrs. Mayfield Blackwood shouted, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You can open that door, give me what the Indian gave you, and I'll forget this ever happened. Or you can stay in there and I will burn this cabin to the ground with you inside it. The choice is yours." The devil had laid his final bargain on the table. Staring down the barrel of her rifle with the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils, Ara Mayfield knew there was no choice at all. She would die with the truth before she would live with a lie. The afternoon bled into a bruised twilight. The standoff was a stalemate of stretched nerves. Ara remained at the window, rifle ready, while Blackwood and Finch stayed out of her line of sight, their shouted threats growing more desperate as darkness approached. The flash of light had not reappeared, and the fragile hope it had sparked was withering. She was alone, trapped, her time measured in the lengthening shadows. Then she heard a new sound. It was faint at first, a low rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was the sound of approaching horses. Not two, but many. Blackwood and Caleb heard it too. Their shouting stopped. The silence that fell was more terrifying than the noise had been. The drumming grew louder, closer. It was a disciplined, powerful sound. Suddenly a voice, sharp and clear as a bugle call, cut through the twilight. "Sheriff Blackwood, this is United States Marshal Elijah Vance. You and your deputy are to drop your weapons and step out with your hands in the air." A U.S. Marshal. Here, it was impossible, a miracle. "It's a trick," Blackwood snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. The marshal's voice came again, closer this time, imbued with unshakable authority. "I have a warrant for your arrest, Sheriff, on charges of conspiracy theft, of federal resources, and murder. I also have you surrounded with 10 deputies. I suggest you comply. Now." Ara scrambled back to the window. In the fading light, she could see them, a line of mounted men, and their forms dark silhouettes against the purple sky, fanned out in a semicircle, rifles trained on her small cabin. She heard a clatter as Caleb Finch's pistol hit the dirt. "Don't shoot, I give up," he squealed. A moment later, after a string of curses, another pistol followed. "All right, Vance, we're coming out," Blackwood yelled, his voice thick with venomous rage. Ara watched as the two men emerged, their hands raised high. The marshal, a tall, severe-looking man, with a graying beard, dismounted and approached them, handcuffs glinting. As his men secured the prisoners, Marshal Vance walked to the cabin door. "Mrs. Mayfield, you can come out now. You're safe." With fumbling fingers, she lifted the bar and pushed the door open. She stepped out into the cool evening air, blinking at the scene. "Marshal," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "How did you know?" Vance gave her a grim, respectful nod. "We weren't the ones who found you, ma'am. He was." He gestured toward the line of deputies. One of them separated from the group and walked forward. He was not a deputy. He was Lakota dressed in buckskin, carrying a rifle with the ease of a man born to it. He was tall and lean, his face a mask of hardened grief, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a flicker of profound gratitude. He looked so much like the man she had buried on the hill. "Wombly," she breathed. He stopped a few feet from her and gave a slow, solemn nod. He spoke English precisely formally. "You are the woman my brother spoke of." His gaze was intense, searching. "Kangi, he came to you." "Yes," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I did what I could." "You did more than that," Wombly said, his voice resonating with deep emotion. "You gave him peace, and you kept his message safe. My brother's spirit was strong. He knew he would not survive. So he rode not to escape, but to deliver his warning to the first honest soul he could find. He found you." The pieces of the puzzle fell into place for Ara. The flash of light she had seen. It had been Wombly tracking his brother. He must have seen Blackwood arrive, seen the standoff begin. He had not intervened directly, knowing he and his warriors would be branded as hostiles. Instead, he had ridden like the wind to the nearest federal outpost and brought back the one authority even a corrupt sheriff could not defy. "The feathers," she said, pulling the pouch from her belt. She held them out to him. "He wanted you to have this." Wombly took them, his fingers closing around them with reverence. "This is our family's mark. Kangi was a scout. He was tracking the desecration of our sacred lands at Black Rock, the place where Blackwood has his mine." Marshal Vance stepped forward. "Mr. Wombly led us right to it. It's just as he said. Blackwood wasn't just a thief, Mrs. Mayfield. He was a fool. He kept meticulous ledgers detailing every ounce of gold he pulled from the ground. We found them in his office safe." Blackwood held fast between two deputies, turned his head, and spat on the ground. "You have nothing. An Indian's word against a duly elected sheriff." "We have more than his word," Vance said, his voice like chips of granite. "We have your ledgers. We have testimony from prospectors you cheated. And we have Mrs. Mayfield, a credible witness you tried to murder in cold blood. That's more than enough to see you hang." The fight went out of Silas Blackwood. His shoulders slumped, and the handsome, confident mask fell away, completely revealing the craven, greedy man beneath. A storm was coming. Not the cleansing fury of a prairie thunderstorm, but a tempest of dust and wind, a suffocating harbinger of the final confrontation. Marshal Vance and his deputies had departed with their prisoners, leaving a small contingent to stand guard. Wombly and his men had taken Kangi's body for its proper journey, leaving Ara with a profound sense of connection and a warning. "Blackwood is a serpent," Wombly had said, "and a serpent's venom remains potent even when its head is caged. His power runs deeper than this town." Wombly was right. The sandstorm hit just after dawn on the second day. It was a monstrous, roiling wall of brown that swallowed the sun and plunged the world into a perpetual gritty twilight. The wind howled like a tortured animal, ripping at the shingles of the cabin and forcing sand through every crack and crevice. The deputies seeking shelter in the barn were effectively blinded and cut off. Ara was alone in her cabin, the world reduced to the four walls around her and the incessant, maddening scream of the wind. It was in the heart of this storm that Silas Blackwood returned. She heard the splintering of the barn door over the shriek of the wind. Gunshots, too sharp and muffled. Then silence. A sickening, heavy silence that was worse than the storm. She knew. He had escaped. His powerful friends, the ones named in his ledgers, had sent men. Blackwood wasn't just a corrupt sheriff. He was the head of a syndicate, and they wouldn't let him fall without a fight. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner became a thunderous countdown. Sand seeped under the door and through the window frames, coating everything in a fine, gritty film. The air was thick, difficult to breathe. The lamp cast a hazy golden gloom, illuminating the swirling dust motes in a chaotic ballet. Then a heavy thud against the cabin door. Mrs. Mayfield Blackwood's voice was a low, chilling rasp, barely audible over the gale. "I've come for my ledger. The one Kangi gave you." Ara's heart seized. A ledger Kangi had given her, no ledger. He had given her a warning and a feather. Blackwood's entire obsession was based on a mistake. "I don't know what you're talking about," she shouted back, her voice thin against the storm. "Don't lie to me," he roared, and the doors shuddered as he threw his weight against it. "He was snooping around my office for weeks. He must have taken it. I know you have it." The heavy bar across the door would not hold for long. She had to think. Her eyes scanned the cabin, her mind racing. Thomas's medical supplies, his books, his knowledge. She scrambled to the chest at the foot of her bed, her hands flying through jars and packets. Chemicals, powders. She knew their properties. Thomas had taught her. The door groaned, the wood splintering around the lock. She had seconds. Grabbing 2 jars, one of potassium chlorate and one of sugar, she mixed a small pile of the white powders on a tin plate. Flash powder. The door crashed open. Blackwood stood there, a specter in the swirling gloom, his face a mask of dust and maniacal fury. Sand billowed in around him, a choking cloud. "Time's up, widow," he snarled, raising his pistol. Ara threw the tin plate into the hearth. The mixture caught the embers and erupted in a blinding, instantaneous flash of white light, accompanied by a deafening whoomp. Blackwood cried out, stumbling back, his hands flying to his eyes, temporarily blinded. Ara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and swung it with all her might, connecting solidly with his gun hand. The pistol clattered to the floor. He roared in pain and fury, shaking his head to clear his vision. He was bigger, stronger, and driven by a rage that bordered on insanity. He lunged for her, his hands like claws. She dodged, her heart pounding. The cabin was a maelstrom of howling wind, swirling sand, and desperate violence. "You think this is about gold?" He spat, his voice cracking with a grief so profound it was terrifying. This was never about gold. He cornered her against the wall, his face inches from hers. His eyes, now clearing, were filled not just with hatred, but with a terrible, broken pain. Years ago, a sickness swept through this territory. Diphtheria. It took my wife, Elizabeth. It took my little boy, Samuel. Ara stared at him, the fight momentarily frozen in her veins by the raw anguish in his voice. They were dying. He choked out tears, carving clean paths through the grime on his face. And the doctor, the great man of science, he could do nothing. He just stood there, wringing his hands, offering platitudes while my family suffocated. He grabbed her arms, his grip like iron bands. "Your husband, Mrs. Mayfield, Dr. Thomas Mayfield, he was an incompetent fool who let my family die. And the sickness, it came from them. The Lakota. They carry these plagues in their blood, a curse on this land. This land that should have been mine, my family's." The world tilted on its axis. This wasn't about greed. It was about a grief that had festered into a monstrous, all-consuming vengeance. The gold was just the means to an end, to acquire enough power to drive the Lakota from the sacred lands he blamed for his loss, to erase them, to create a world where the source of his pain no longer existed. He saw her husband's failure and the Lakota's very existence as two sides of the same coin. "My husband tried to save everyone," Ara whispered, her voice trembling. "He grieved for every life he lost. His grief didn't bring my son back." Blackwood screamed, shaking her violently. "He failed. And you? You helped the savage who was part of the disease that killed them. You chose them over me, over Elizabeth's memory." His insane logic had twisted her act of compassion into a final, unforgivable betrayal. In that moment, Ira saw the full depth of his madness. He wasn't a villain. He was a tragedy, a man so broken by loss he had become a monster. But sympathy wouldn't save her. As he raised a hand to strike her, her fingers found a small pouch on her belt. A packet of powdered capsicum Thomas had used for poultices. With a desperate sob, she ripped it open and threw the contents into his face. The red pepper hit his eyes. He screamed a raw, agonized sound of pure shock and pain and released her, clawing at his face. That was her chance. She grabbed the heavy Winchester from the table, not by the stock, but by the barrel. As he stumbled blindly toward her, she swung it like a club, putting every ounce of her fear, her grief, and her will to survive into the blow. The solid wood stock connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. Silas Blackwood crumpled to the floor and lay still, the howling of the storm his only eulogy. Ara stood over him, panting, the rifle heavy in her hands. The grandfather clock ticked on, marking the seconds of her survival. The storm raged outside, but inside the dark, sand-filled cabin, a different kind of storm had just passed. Just then the door was filled by two figures, rifles raised against the gale. It was Wombly and Marshal Vance. They had heard the shots and circled back. They lowered their weapons, their eyes taking in the scene, Ara standing bruised but resolute, Blackwood unconscious at her feet. They hadn't saved her. They had arrived to witness her victory. In the calm after the storm, the world felt scoured clean. Blackwood, bound and disgraced, was taken away by Marshal Vance. The ledgers, Vance confirmed, had been in his safe all along, their evidence damning enough to bring down his entire syndicate. His bloody crusade against Ara had been for a phantom. Wombly and his people arrived to claim Kangi's body. The air was filled with their mournful chants, a song of sorrow and homecoming that drifted over the prairie. Before they left, Wombly stood before Ara. There was a quiet, powerful understanding between them, a bond forged in shared loss and a fight for justice. "My brother's spirit can rest now," he said, his formal English imbued with deep emotion. "You have honored him, Ara Mayfield. You have honored us all." He acknowledged the shared history that now connected them, a corrupt lawman, a failed doctor, and two families shattered by death. Ara knew she could not stay. The homestead held too many ghosts, both beloved and monstrous. After testifying at the trial in Fort Laramie, a trial that would expose the rot at the heart of the territory, her life would be her own, again an unwritten map. On the morning she was to leave, she walked up the small rise behind the cabin one last time. The prairie stretched out before her, vast and indifferent, the grasses whispering on a wind that smelled of clean earth. She stood between two graves. One held her husband Thomas, a good man, whose best efforts had been deemed a failure in the eyes of a madman. The other held Kangi, a stranger, who had become a brother in spirit, a man whose last request had unearthed her own strength. She thought of Thomas, of his kindness, his dedication, and the unintended tragic consequences of his life's work. She thought of Blackwood, a man consumed by a grief she understood all too well. A mirror image of what she could have become had she let sorrow turn to poison. From her pocket, she took the carved hawk feather Wombly had insisted she keep. It was a symbol of a warrior's promise, but it was also now a symbol of her own survival, her own purpose found in the crucible of violence and loss. With a quiet reverence, she knelt and placed the feather on the packed earth of her husband's grave. It was an act of letting go of the past she had clung to, of the grief that had defined her, of the woman she had been. Mounting Bess, she did not look back. She rode away from the cabin, from the graves, from Redemption Creek. She was no longer a grieving widow, hiding from the world, but a woman who had faced down a storm both inside and out, and had emerged into the sunlight. The road ahead was uncertain, stretching toward a horizon that shimmered with the promise of a life yet to be lived.